don't know about you all, but this is my second time watching through the films, and very, very inspired by the work that each of you do. How many folks inspired? There we go. Just out of curiosity, how many athletes are in the room? Oh, there we go. Okay. My name is Theo Ellington. I am honored to host this evening, and I want to put all the spotlight on the filmmakers here, but just a little bit about me. I got my master's degree from the University of San Francisco in urban affairs, and I was a filmmaker who went to School of the Arts High School. So this is, like, I love this right now. I got so much joy out of watching these films and participating in this. And most recently, I was the Director of Public Affairs for the Golden State Warriors. So this is a few Warrior fans in the house, awesome. But I just want to go down the line. I want to have the filmmakers and the educator introduce themselves, and I've got an opening question after you give sort of your bio, and that is, I want you to talk a little bit about the biggest takeaway from the film as it pertains to sports, community, and public spaces. I know that's a mouthful, but just your gut reaction after watching the film again, obviously, but wanting you to share some of that with the audience.
Hello. Okay. Hi. So I'm Avni. I directed White Elephants. I am not trained as a filmmaker. I'm an architect full time, and but I think it's really important to tell the stories of our work. And do I answer the question now?
Yeah.
Do we introduce?
Okay, we'll do intros first, and then we'll come back to that first question.
Okay, we'll do.
Just to make it easier.
My name is June Stinson. I directed Futbolistas for Life, originally from Oakland. Should we wait for the question?
Yeah, we'll wait.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Oscar Guerra, and I directed City Surf Project.
I'm Dania Cabello. I was the coach in the film that you just watched.
So takeaways?
Go ahead.
All right. I think the biggest takeaway for me right now is sport is so powerful, right? It can really bring people together. You can have community. It's really inspiring. And we have on one end this community building aspect, and in my film, White Elephants, this other side of sport, which is the mega projects and the money and the fame and all the people. So, with the promises that come with that aren't always fulfilled, and we got to think about how we're, putting the community first.
I would say that sports, safe spaces, spaces for youth to play and youth empowerment, supportive educators is really a matter of life or death.
I'm a professor at San Francisco State. I teach in the Beca department, so it's television pretty much. And I've been doing a lot of documentary for social change. I try to reframe the immigrant experience here in the United States, and I've been finding a lot of the different components that affect and the empowerment and how we try to create community and how we try to find identity. And of course, during my research, I realized that sports, it's one of the main components that can help you in many different ways. So that's why I started, I'm not a surfer at all, but I started realizing, and with the help of a couple of my colleagues, some of them are here actually, they told me about this organization, and I was like, you know what, I think it's amazing that you can think not just as sports, we know about football, but sports that are not completely related, we will be considered Latino or Mexicano, and I just thought that there was a great story there. So in my case, and I'm very inspired by the films that I watched tonight, that we're able to provide that empowerment and build community with something that's important and something that we all enjoy as much as sports.
So my takeaway is a little different because I wasn't involved in producing the film in any capacity. I was just in it, as you saw. But I think one of the things of having a camera on you and seeing something told over 7 years, it's a mirror of sorts. It offers a reflection. And so for me, it's one of my biggest takeaways has been the importance of being critical of my own involvement and participation, my own language, and the importance to be critical of play. And I say critical kind of a la, there's this beautiful James Baldwin quote where he says, I'm going to paraphrase it, but I love America more than any country in the world, and for that reason I insist on my right to criticize her perpetually. And that's how I feel about sport, is that it's kind of my job, it's seeing something that's been built over so long, to be constantly critiquing it, who's being heard, who's being seen, who's not being heard, who's not centered, who's not playing. So that's my biggest takeaway.
You can clap, that's okay. So I think you all sort of, with your statements, set the frame for what I want this discussion to look like. We know that sports and the major sort of fanfare that comes with it, we know that through this filmmaking process that you all capture that beauty of what sports can provide for a community, this cohesion, the integration, diversity, and more so than anything else, it brings folks together. I mean, imagine being at a sports arena or playing sports. You've got people from all walks of life, all walks of socioeconomic income coming together to cheer for a team or to compete, and I think that's very, very powerful. The other thing that I really appreciated about the films is that it captured the other side of that as well in so many ways, and really captured the issues that urban cities are facing all across the world. Rising inequality, sprawl to sort of suburbia, as I like to call it, increased cost of living, and a host of other sort of social and political issues. What we're starting to see is this sort of privatization of sort of public open spaces, and we're starting to see this class divide caused by some of these political and social issues that you guys addressed in the film. So with that, I think, Dania, I want to open up with you. The quote I thought at the end of the film was very, very powerful that you mentioned, that soccer and spaces are places of resistance. And that's not sort of what you would normally see or normally hear from young folks, right? They're playing the game, and they have all of these other externalities that they're dealing with. Can you talk a little bit about just the grant process and how that did it create a sense of permanent space for those young folks in a time of so much uncertainty for them?
Thanks for that question. I imagine, I can't speak for them, but I imagine that it did, in the sense that many of their younger siblings and cousins now play on that field as their home field. And so to be able to see your own family kind of claim that space that they know they were a part of building, I think I imagine it to be pretty powerful, just because that's how I feel when I see kids running on it. I'm like, this is really special. And at the same time, it's riddled with contradiction too, because that field is a turf field with these rubber pellets that requires maintenance, and the type of maintenance to keep that field going requires heavy machinery that's really expensive. And after I had left the school, the then administrator was renting that field space to private soccer group from from the further East Bay, and so at around 6 o'clock they would come in with their mobile lights, and all the students from Life Academy would get kicked off so that kids from Walnut Creek and Orinda could come and access it. So it's both beautiful, and it's also, because sport, like you mentioned, is kind of, it's filled with contradiction. It's not just this like happy, flowery, perfect utopia that we would like it to be. Yeah.
And just to follow, June, you obviously directed the film, and a lot of the stories that were captured, we learned that the young folks use soccer as a tool to deal with some of these social problems: immigration, education, violence, family separation, etc. Were the process of going through to tell their stories, was this a form of liberation for some of these young folks as you were going through this process?
Like participating in the film?
Sure, I would say being able to articulate what they're going through. And a lot of the stories were similar. And, for someone to be going through the same thing as their teammate, I would think that there's some sort of parallel there in terms of how one might get through some of those issues.
I don't know if the process, I would have to ask them if the process of being in the film was felt liberatory or was a process of liberation for them. So
yeah, I guess just to clarify the question, you've got these young folks dealing with such a wide array of issues, right? I mentioned the immigration and the violence that particularly stood out to me. Can you share a little bit about what that was, just hearing from them and listening to some of those stories that they shared? Yeah,
so going into this film, I knew that I was very much interested in how Life Academy students were campaigning for a field in response to really tragic incidences that had taken place over a number of years, where Life Academy had lost a number of students to gun violence. And so I was just personally very inspired by how they were processing that and how they were responding to that, and the mentors like Dania and others who were supporting them through that. And I knew I wanted to tell that story, but I knew I wanted to tell it through the lens of the youth and through the lens of Dania, not entirely sure of what stories would unfold. I did know that Life Academy was a predominantly a school made up of predominantly Latinx first and second generation immigrant youth. So I imagined that some of the experiences that many first and second generation immigrant youth in Oakland are dealing with would find its way in the film. But I didn't really know Dania or Ben's personal stories until I really started filming, and I discovered, Ben was applying for DACA, and that was really a matter of whether he got DACA or not was really a matter of whether he'd be able to go to college or not. And April was dealing with a lot of anxiety and stress that had to do with not only being a high school student, but being in the home of, a family with undocumented parents. There was a lot of financial stress, and then the tension that existed between her and her father in terms of, them trying to be the best parents that they could be for their daughter, but having come from Mexico, where, parenting for them, parenting was different. It was I think a challenge to figure out how to raise a young woman who was born and raised in the U.S. And so I feel like the Futbolistas was a space for these youth to be to be free and to be safe, and to process all these many challenges that they were experiencing in their lives, both as the children of immigrant parents, being immigrants themselves, and being simply high school students who were dealing with, the daily stress and anxiety of school.
Awesome. Well, just for the record, you've captured those precious moments very, very beautifully in the film, so thank you for that. Oscar, the next question is for you. We know, I mentioned earlier this, where cities are sort of shifting, and I call it the commodification of things that are supposed to be public. And we see that play out in open spaces all the time. But your film explored a different avenue where you took kids into the ocean, and particularly in communities of color, where I know I've never surfed before. So it was amazing the way the story played out. We talked on the phone before this, and you mentioned being able to use film to tell stories and sort of uplifting socially driven films in your role as a professor. Can you talk a little bit about how you use film to break down those barriers associated with communities of color?
Of course. So some of the classes that I teach at San Francisco State, it's the advanced television class, video production classes, editing classes. So what I try to do, I try to incorporate a lot of community service learning into my classes, because I've realized that the students have great stories to share with us, and learning about the media and how to produce media becomes an excuse to tell your own story. So I think that that's what I try to do. The project that you watched, CitySurf project, that was directed by me, but it was pretty much with the help of all of my students. And what I normally do is I try to work with 8 to 10 students each semester. I teach my class, but I also try to work with them. And there was one that helped me, being camera operators, audio recorders, sound designers, animation, graphics, everything. And it becomes, I started developing this kind of like way of teaching, in which I say, media is so powerful, and what better way to do it when you go to school? And because this is pretty much a school project, that it has, grabbed attention from many people outside. And I would say that it's also kind of like my moral responsibility as a professor, to show you how to use the media to be critical. I think that you were mentioning that a second ago. Each opportunity it's a good opportunity to become critical of what you're doing, and learning how to use the cameras, learning how to use the editing software becomes an excuse to tell your own story in a very critical way. And I realized that producing stuff like this it's pretty expensive. It's not cheap at all. And the thing is that with most of the nonprofits that I work for, normally they don't have the funds to be able to produce a project like this. Mine was a 10-minute project. And even something like that can be really expensive. So what I've been trying to do is develop a way for us to get grants, so we're able to go and help that community partner that we have, and keep producing this media, because I think that's the only way in which you can actually start transforming the landscape of media, not through sports, through food, through fashion. There are so many different components. And yeah, I think that it's, in my case, I try to use every opportunity as a pedagogical opportunity to be critical and produce this type of media.
Awesome. And Avni, just to, before we open it up for audience questions, you mentioned earlier these big mega projects, and obviously your film featured what was going on in Africa, and I think it really captured some of the culture that we don't necessarily get to see. And there's a couple things that stood out for me when the gentleman stated that football is our religion and our language, and you look on the opposite end of the spectrum, where they're spending $10 million for upkeep and only getting $3 million in return in terms of economic benefits. you also mentioned that this was your first time making a film, and you are an architect by trade. Can you talk a little bit about how you use your work and design to make spaces available to regular people?
Yeah, wow. So a bit long question.
Yes, sorry.
I think the situation in South Africa, even though, we're looking at a different culture, a different country, there's takeaways for people everywhere and for us as well. And the thing that they did was they built 10 stadiums in a country, right? They built 6 brand new stadiums for major upgrades, and there was no collaboration with the communities. So, in my work, what I do here, we try to bring in communities in the early design phase. We try to think about scale in White Elephants. Those stadiums were 50,000 to 100,000 people capacities. Like, that is really difficult to fill. And so just a simple thing like that, thinking about who are the people that are going to use this building, how are they going to use it, how are some ways that we can get multiple uses out of it, how can we open it up to the public, and getting people to participate in that process, because it's often very, this is what we're going to do. Like in Cape Town, that was a missed opportunity. There was a stadium in one of the townships that had a huge soccer base, but instead, just from the top, from FIFA, this is where we're going to put the stadium at the waterfront with a view, right? And you just got to be inclusive. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Give it up one more time. So now I want to open it up to the audience. This is your chance to participate. I see a hand in the purple, the lovely purple sweater.
Thank you.
Can you state your name?
I'm Sally Barros. I was wondering what the panel thought about the fact that in the East Bay there's quite a bit of movement now with the Oakland Coliseum complex being basically potentially decommissioned, with the major sports teams leaving, the A's sort of fade up in the air, and the sort of reaction to the communities in the East Bay to having a A's ballpark, and the issue of you could also talk about since we're in the city, the gentrification of Dogpatch as the Warriors move into that neighborhood.
Anyone want to begin? Just the first half of that question about Oakland and sports teams there.
I actually have a question for you. Do you know what the conversation is with what's going to happen with the stadium? Because I don't know.
I just know that the Raiders are moving to Las Vegas, the Warriors are moving to San Francisco, and the A's are clearly looking for different digs, because they had potentially a spot near Jack London, and then I'm not sure what their other locations are, but the neighborhood in the Jack London area rejected that, I believe. Yeah. There may have been another West Oakland or East Oakland site that also got rejected. I'm not that up to date myself.
Yeah.
I can jump in here. Sorry. I'll answer the second half of that question about San Francisco and the Warriors Arena happening in the Mission Bay Dogpatch neighborhood. I think one of the, and I don't work there anymore for the record, so I can tell you how I really feel. I think the situation that we have in San Francisco and welcoming the Warriors back home is a bit different. Number one, because the landscape that was Mission Bay before sort of didn't exist. It was old empty warehouse for quite some time. and that allows one to be able to really build out that neighborhood into the liking and ensure that it reflects the values of the folks who live in and around the arena. One of the greatest things that about this project that no other major sports team has done is privately finance the entire development. If you look at cities like Detroit going bankrupt and financing a new arena, Milwaukee financing a new arena on behalf of the people. So what you see in Mission Bay is a bit different. I think, at least what I try to do in my job, is I was the one sort of holding the new arena developers accountable to the neighborhood. So when you dump an arena into a city, which is the trend, and we're starting to see this happen all across the states, you have to invest in other things. You've got to invest in the people who actually live in the area. You've got to provide real jobs for folks. You've got to invest in education and invest in the things that the neighborhood needs. And I think the Warriors have done a pretty decent job at that, but still have a long way to go in terms of really impacting the lives of the folks who live in that area. And just to put it into perspective, a stone's throw away, you have the highest concentration of public housing right next to homes that are being sold literally across the street for upwards of $1.5 million. So the dynamic there is harsh, but I think it takes major investments from an organization like the Warriors to help those social ills. In terms of Oakland, real quickly, losing the Raiders and the A's sort of looking for a new facility, that's going to take, I think, the people of Oakland kicking and screaming, because that, at the end of the day, is who these mega projects affect. And you really need a commitment from the top. You need a leadership at the executive level, whether that be the mayor or these new organizations coming in, who really want to see this benefit the great city of Oakland. So,
in the middle here.
Yep.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Maylee. So first, I just want to congratulate and commend all of you, because I know that this kind of work comes from the heart, and it's a lot of hard work, and it's something you put a lot of care into. So first of all, just that's amazing. So second, I just wanted to say a little bit. I'm trying to keep it short, but the background is that obviously one of the spine of any documentary is like the narrative, and I think narrative is something that all of us are finding increasingly. No matter what line of work you're in, your narrative matters. And I think one of the things that's really hard, at least watching from the outside in documentary work, is like how you find that narrative over time and tell it. Whose voices you're centering, whose narrative you're centering, and whether or not you're able to capture the voices and tell the narrative and center the stories you want to center. So sort of with the critical thinking hat on, I'd love to hear from all of you, first of all, how you chose the voices and the narrative that you centered in the story, and whether or not you felt, looking back at it now, or even during the process, that there were voices that you wished you could have gotten more of or centered more of, or anything along those lines. So I'd love to hear about that.
Right. So in White Elephants, I thought a lot about the narrative style. I was definitely aware of being an outsider, telling the story of this country and the aftermath of this huge event. And it was really important that the story was told through the voices of the people in these cities, and it was all different people that had various roles in either planning the event, or they started a business because the World Cup was happening, or they were just affected by it. I thought a lot about what is my voice in this, and it really came together when I came back and sat down with all the footage and tried to figure out what is the positive, what is the negative, and at the end I do leave it up to the viewer, was it worth it? You know, there were some benefits. The image of the country was raised. People had a great time for a month. It was a great memory. But were all the costs worth it? And we also kind of, the implied answer is no, it wasn't.
Going into Futbolistas for life, I knew that I wanted to tell the story through the lens of youth in the Futbolistas program, and also through Dania's life too. And I knew that I wanted, it being a co-ed program, I knew I wanted to follow, a boy and a girl, and there were only a few girls in the program, and from the get-go, April, being a first-year student at Life Academy, had just this incredible dynamic personality and charisma, and I spent some time just doing really light interviews with the students, and it was very clear to me that she took to the camera, she liked to be on camera, and the other two girls really didn't. And one girl was very clear, like she was just very clear that she didn't want to be on camera. The other girl, just wasn't as comfortable. And I was just really, interested in where April was heading that year. I mean, it was clear that she was a leader. And so that's really why I followed her. And I knew a little bit because she had shared with me about her parents, and she had shared a little bit about the dynamics in her family, but I really didn't know too much about her relationship with her parents. I didn't know anything about the anxiety that she was experiencing until I really started filming. And Ben, I spent time at Life Academy without my camera and just hanging out at the school and hanging out with the Futbolistas after school and talking to teachers and mentors and trying to get a sense of who the students were. And I had learned that Ben was applying for DACA, and this was in 2012. So this was right after Obama had passed DACA, and at the time, there weren't many visual stories that I had seen following the journey of these youth. And so I was really interested. My original plan was just to film for a year. And so I was interested in where Ben was headed. And so that's why I decided to focus on both Ben and April, and knowing that for the type of film I wanted to make, honing in on more than two youth would be complicated and a challenge and difficult for the audience to consume. And so I knew I wanted to limit it to one or two students, and share Dania's story in all of that too, because I had learned about Dania's background, and that really, although her family's story coming into the U.S. was very different from Ben and April's, there were some similarities in the sense that, her parents and her sisters were uprooted from their lives, came to Oakland, and had to, not speaking English, having to rebuild their lives once again. And, I think in many ways, and I don't want to speak for you, Dania, but it was very clear to me that Dania connected so well to these youth, and these youth, were inspired by her. And I think that, on top of Dania being just an incredible educator and coach and powerful soccer player, I was just interested in also sharing her background. So that's how I made my decision on the narrative to follow.
I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet because I know there might be some other questions. I think it's a brilliant question, and I think it's the toughest question to respond. Because when you choose something, you're renouncing to other options, right? Yeah. And then when you're drafting your visual essay, for me this is an article, but in a visual form, it's really tough. Because you're drafting and then you go back to the blackboard and you're like, okay, I think I have this character as they're talking about this. Then you start thinking about different themes or chapters that you want to talk about. But I mean, in this case in particular, and we have Olivia here from City Surf Project. I'm sure you recognize her. Like, she gave me this amazing interview, and I'm like, man, with this I can come up with a 30-minute project, Because it was one thing after the next one, and it's really hard for you when you're the director and you're editing as well, because you're like, the narrative is the most important part, and there's so many good things that you can talk about, and in a way, it's that's why you have to make the tough calls, and it's like, okay, I need to talk about this, and I need to talk about this other thing, because you have limited resources, you have limited time. And you can start, exploring so many different avenues, but in the end, you have to be able to come up with a final product. So I think that question is so relevant, and I'm going to keep thinking about that question because I think that it's your narrative is something very organic that it's going to develop over time. I try, whenever I'm starting a project, I try to listen more than what I say, because I try to understand the voice of my participants first, and then I try to honor that voice as much as I can. So maybe I didn't respond to that question. I just share that it's a really, really hard thing to do.
Awesome. Yeah. We're gonna take one last question here. We're running out of time, so if we can make this quick, that would be amazing.
Yeah, so it seems like a unifying theme that Avni mentioned is the notion of scale. On one end, in South Africa, massive stadium, unsustainable, it's a crater in the society. And on the other end, you have a small field that is financially sustainable, that becomes rehabilitation for anxiety disorders, that becomes fighting against social injustice, inequality. My question for the moderator and the panelist on the end is, don't professional sports teams that engender so much of our loyalty and then leave craters, like the Ravens in Baltimore, where I'm from, promised jobs when they created the new stadium there. That didn't materialize. They displaced homeless people, displaced all sorts of communities, and they know we're addicted. Don't they have a moral responsibility to support the sustainable small field and help rebuild these communities?
You can clap. It's okay. That's okay. You're absolutely right. During my tenure with the Warriors, we were able to even create more opportunities for folks to play in underprivileged communities, where we refurbished, during my tenure, at least 10 basketball courts in the community of San Francisco, Alameda County, that are most affected by the sport. But you were spot on in that analysis that there's a moral responsibility for, I would say, all corporations to give back in a meaningful way.
I'll just add that thank you for bringing that up. I think that's a brilliant and really important direction that we need to start pushing into major league sports. As somebody who's from Oakland and has a lot of friends who are also still from Oakland, we actually, many of us, I don't speak for all, but myself, I kind of feel like, all right, Raiders, peace. Bye, Warriors, peace. You guys were situated for how many decades in one of the most economically and socially isolated communities in deep East Oakland. Yet there was very little, if any, trickle into the community in terms of jobs, small businesses, food industry, nothing. So in many ways, I'm like, all right, let's make space for the other possibilities.
All right. Raise your hand if you enjoyed yourself tonight. I'm going off script here, but one final ask. You see the social media up here. I encourage you to follow and post about the event tonight. This is the 5th annual film festival, and we want to continue this because this discussion is important. Give it up one more time for the panelists.